I still remember the first time a child asked me what happens when someone dies. Not in a dramatic way, not in tears, just casually, like they were asking about the weather. And I almost did what most adults do. I almost softened it. I almost reached for one of those gentle phrases we all grew up hearing. They've gone to sleep, or they've gone on a long journey. But here's the problem with children: they take you seriously, always, literally. No filters, no emotional translation layer, just pure meaning. So when we dodge the truth, we don't protect them, we confuse them. And I've learned something over the years that most people only discover after making the mistake once or twice. Children don't fall apart because of the truth about death. They fall apart when the truth feels hidden, inconsistent, or scary in ways they can't decode. So, in this video, I want to walk through what actually happens in a child's mind when death enters the room, and how we, as adults, can talk about it without fear, without confusion, and without unintentionally creating anxiety that lasts longer than the grief itself. Because the goal is not to make death easy, that's impossible. The goal is to make it understandable enough that a child doesn't feel like the world just broke a rule they were never told about. Children don't understand death the way adults assume they do. That's usually where the whole problem starts. We hear the word death and we think permanence, finality, biology, everything stopping. But a child's mind doesn't automatically come packaged with that understanding. It builds it in layers, like a slow unfolding map. For very young children, say around preschool age, death is often treated like something temporary, not because they're being silly, but because their brains are still wired for reversibility. If something disappears, it can come back. If someone leaves, they can return. So when a child hears grandma died, what they often hear internally is grandma is away, but maybe she'll come back later. That's why you sometimes see them asking the same question again and again. It's not forgetfulness, it's testing reality. Now, as they get older, around primary school age, something shifts. They start to understand that death is permanent, but they don't yet understand its boundaries. So their questions get sharper. Will I die? Will you die? Who's next? This is where anxiety can quietly begin if the answers they get are vague or emotionally inconsistent. And teenagers, they understand death very clearly, sometimes too clearly. But instead of confusion, you may see emotional shutdown, irritability, or a strange detachment. Not because they don't care, but because they're trying to control something they can't control by acting like they're unaffected. There's also something most adults miss completely. Children are naturally self referential when it comes to big events. If someone dies, a child may quietly wonder if they caused it, especially if they had a recent argument, a moment of anger, or even just a fleeting, I wish they would go away thought. Their minds don't separate emotion from causation the way adult logic does. So, when we avoid explaining things clearly, their imagination fills in the gaps. And imagination, in a child's world, is always more powerful than silence. That's why understanding how they process death isn't just helpful, it's essential before you even open your mouth. This is where things usually go wrong, and not because adults are careless, but because they're trying to be kind without realizing how a child's mind interprets language. The most common mistake is what I call soft replacement language. Instead of saying someone has died, adults say things like, they've gone to sleep, we lost them, or they've gone on a journey. On the surface, it sounds gentle, protective even, but children don't interpret metaphors emotionally the way adults do. They interpret them literally. So, gone to sleep can quietly become fear of sleeping. Lost can sound like something that might be found again. Gone away can create confusion about whether they chose to leave. I once watched a child refuse to nap for weeks after hearing that a relative went to sleep and didn't wake up. Not because they were being difficult, but because their brain made a very simple connection: sleep equals disappearance. Another mistake is emotional silence. Adults sometimes think that if they don't talk about it, they're protecting the child. But silence doesn't remove the reality, it just removes guidance. And without guidance, children construct their own explanations, often worse than the truth. Then there's overloading with vague spirituality or abstract comfort. They're in a better place. God needed them. They're watching over you. These can be meaningful in some contexts, but for a child who is still trying to understand basic permanence, they often create confusion instead of comfort. The child is left trying to solve a puzzle they don't have the tools for. And perhaps the most overlooked mistake, rushing past the emotional moment. Adults, understandably uncomfortable, tend to move quickly into distraction or problem solving. Food, toys, let's go out, anything to shift the mood. But children don't need escape immediately. They need orientation first. A moment where the world is explained clearly enough that their nervous system can settle. When that doesn't happen, grief doesn't disappear, it just becomes unstructured. And unstructured emotions tend to show up later in behavior. Anxiety, clinginess, anger, or sudden questions days or weeks after everyone else has moved on. The truth is, children don't need perfect words, they need accurate ones. Simple, steady, and emotionally honest enough that their imagination doesn't have to do all the work. This is the part most adults overthink, but ironically, children respond best when we stop trying to be perfect and start being clear. When explaining death to a child, the goal is not emotional poetry. It is cognitive clarity with emotional safety. The simplest and most effective way to say it is also the most uncomfortable for adults. Plain truth, without euphemism. Something like, the person's body stopped working. That means they cannot breathe, eat, talk, or come back anymore. Now, I know that sounds blunt, but for a child, clarity is comfort. Confusion is what creates fear. What matters next is how you deliver it. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, almost like you are explaining a difficult but natural fact about the world, because that is exactly what it is. And then you pause. That pause is important. Children don't process big information immediately, they absorb it in waves. If you keep talking, you end up filling a space their brain hasn't had time to enter yet. After that, expect questions. And here's where adults often panic and start improvising. But it's better to stay simple and consistent. If they ask, will they come back? The answer should be, no, they won't come back. If they ask, why did they die? It's okay to say, sometimes bodies stop working because of illness or age. Sometimes we don't fully understand why. What you avoid is guessing, over explaining, or turning it into something mystical just to soften it. And then comes the most important sentence you can ever say in that moment. This is not your fault. You may not think a child would assume responsibility, but many do, especially if there was any emotional tension, distance, or even just normal childhood frustration before the loss. Emotionally, children are not just listening to information, they are checking their safety in it. So reassurance matters, but it has to be calm and grounded, not exaggerated. Finally, allow emotion without correction. If they cry, let them cry. If they go quiet, let them go quiet. If they ask the same question again, answer it again. Because repetition is how children stabilize reality. You are not trying to fix grief here. You are helping them understand what is real in a world that suddenly feels less predictable. When death enters a child's world, the reaction is rarely neat. And that surprises adults who expect tears, questions, or obvious sadness. In reality, children respond in patterns that can look completely unrelated to grief. Some will cry immediately and intensely, then go back to playing as if nothing happened. Others go quiet, almost too quiet. Some become unusually clingy. Others act irritated, defiant, or even indifferent. And here's the key misunderstanding. None of these reactions are wrong. They are just different ways a developing nervous system tries to process something it cannot fully control. One of the most common reactions is what looks like emotional switching. A child may ask about the death, cry for a moment, then suddenly want snacks or cartoons. Adults often misread this as lack of seriousness, but for children, emotions come in short waves. They don't stay in one emotional state for long because their system isn't built for sustained emotional holding yet. Another pattern is regression. A child who was independent may suddenly become more dependent, wanting to sleep near adults, asking repetitive reassurance questions, or behaving younger than their age. This isn't manipulation. It's the brain trying to regain a sense of safety by going back to earlier, simpler emotional states. Then there's silence, and silence is the one that unsettles adults the most. A quiet child is not necessarily an unaffected child. Often, they are processing internally, trying to organize something that feels too large to verbalize. Interrupting that silence with forced conversation or distraction can sometimes delay their processing instead of helping it. The most important role of an adult in these moments is not explanation, it is emotional containment. That means staying present without trying to correct, rush, or minimize what the child is feeling. If they cry, you stay. If they ask questions repeatedly, you answer calmly again. If they go quiet, you don't panic fill the space with noise. And perhaps the most powerful thing you can do is allow them to see appropriate adult emotion. Not uncontrolled breakdown, but honest sadness. Because when children see adults naming grief without collapsing, they learn something crucial. Sadness is survivable. There is also something subtle that matters deeply here: routine. Meals, school, bedtime, small daily structures. These are not trivial. They act like emotional anchors. When everything feels uncertain, routine quietly tells a child life is still continuing. What you are really doing in this stage is not managing grief itself. You are managing the environment around the grief so the child does not feel emotionally abandoned inside it. After the funeral, most adults assume the hard part is over. For children, that is often when the real processing begins. This is because the event itself, the gathering, the explanations, the visible sadness, creates a temporary structure around the idea of death. It feels organized, shared. Even if painful, it has context. But when everyone returns to normal life, that structure disappears, and suddenly the child is left with a quieter, more confusing reality. The person is still gone, but the world has moved on. This is where grief becomes less about shock and more about repetition. Children don't process loss in a single emotional arc. They revisit it randomly, sometimes weeks later, sometimes in completely ordinary moments that seem unrelated. A smell, a place, a song, a family routine. Something small triggers the realization again. They are still not here. And when that happens, they may ask the same questions again. Not because they forgot, but because their brain is checking if reality has changed. It hasn't, but they still need confirmation. One of the most important things adults often miss is that grief in children is nonlinear. There is no moving on in a straight line. There are returns, repeats, emotional echoes. So consistency matters more than intensity. You don't need new speeches every time. You need stable answers, the same calm explanation, the same reassurance, the same grounded truth. Another key part of this stage is memory integration. Children cope better when the person who died is not erased from conversation. Avoiding the name or pretending they never existed can create emotional confusion. Instead, simple remembrance helps. Stories, photos, or small mentions that normalize the fact that love and loss can exist together. It's also important to watch behavioral changes over time, not just immediate reactions. Some children show delayed responses, changes in sleep, school focus, mood swings, or sudden sensitivity weeks after the event. This doesn't automatically signal something wrong, but it does signal that grief is still active internally. And through all of this, the most stabilizing force is predictability. Not pretending everything is fine, but showing that even in loss, life continues in structured, familiar ways. Because what a child is really trying to rebuild after a death is not just understanding, it is safety. And safety comes less from explanations and more from emotional reliability over time. When you strip everything back, what children need in the face of death is not a perfect explanation. It is emotional clarity, delivered consistently by someone who doesn't avoid the truth. Because death, for a child, is not just a concept, it is a disruption of the world as they understand it. And in that disruption, silence is rarely comforting. It usually becomes a space where fear grows quietly. The most important takeaway from everything we've discussed is simple. Children handle truth far better than uncertainty disguised as comfort. When we use clear language, when we allow emotion without correction, when we stay present instead of rushing them out of discomfort, we give them something far more valuable than answers. We give them stability. And stability is what allows grief to become something they can carry rather than something that overwhelms them. There is also something quietly powerful that many adults underestimate. Children remember how they were spoken to in moments like this. Not just the words, but the tone, the patience, the willingness to stay present when things felt uncomfortable. That becomes part of how they learn to understand loss long after the moment has passed. So, if there's one thing I would leave you with, it's this. You don't need to be eloquent, you don't need to be emotionally perfect, and you definitely don't need to have all the answers. You just need to be honest enough that your words don't create fear and steady enough that your presence feels safe. If you've ever had to explain loss to a child, or if you struggled with what to say, I genuinely like to hear how it went for you in the comments. I do go through them, and sometimes the most useful insights come from real experiences like yours. And if this helped you think differently about how children process grief, like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more conversations that make parenting a little less confusing and a lot more human.